This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So this afternoon, we're going to start out by talking about religion and immigrant integration, thinking specifically about the ways both immigrant communities change religious practices, religious community, religious ideas when they come into a new context. So how established communities in many ways are changed by the presence of immigrant communities, but also thinking about the ways that immigrant religiosity changes as people migrate from one place to another. As you know, the bios for all of the speakers are in the program book, so I'll only briefly introduce them, starting with my right. Abdullah Naeem is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Law at Emory University School of Law. To his right, Jehu Handseals is the D.W. and Ruth Brooks Associate Professor of World Christianity at Candler School of Theology. To his right, Don Seaman, Associate Professor, Emory Department of Religion and Tam Institute of Jewish Studies. And to his right, the Reverend Karen Lyons, Senior Pastor at Clarkston United Methodist Church. So to get started, I think we're all familiar with the traditional narrative, at least it's a traditional narrative in the U.S., of immigrant communities coming, creating immigrant enclaves, either ethnic or ethnic and religious in character, and then a slow process of assimilation into the broader community. And in many ways, markers of ethnic or religious identity are expected to disappear in that process of assimilation. Those are complicated narratives. They're complicated narratives both about social cohesion, about community building, but also about discrimination, racialization, and other aspects of minority and majority culture. And it's certainly not a story that's limited to the U.S. There are many countries around the world that use a similar narrative of immigration. But what I'm wondering is, in your experiences, in your research or in your personal experiences, how that sort of traditional or established narrative compares with what you're seeing in the arrival of immigrant communities into the U.S. or into other countries today. How are immigrant communities challenging this story, and what role does religion play in that process? My guess is that each of you will have some thoughts on this particular subject, so I'm just going to start to my right here with Professor Naeem.
Okay. I'm a Muslim. I'm an African-American Muslim. Therefore, I'm very much the subject of this panel. In that, with my family, we are here as immigrants, and we have been here for some 20 years or so. I think that what I found is probably the timing and the locations of points of entry and settlement around the country can impact the experience of immigrants and of host communities or receiving communities of the immigration experience. In that, I'm curious about Muslims being the latest of immigrant communities to come into the country. On the one hand, I know that we are not homogeneous communities either. So to assume that because we are immigrant and Muslim that we are homogeneous is misleading. That in fact there may be factions of the immigrant Muslim community that are more open to assimilation or resistant to assimilation than others. Second, I'm also thinking about the actual physical locations of point of entry. I suspect that large urban centers are not very conducive to community formation unless there are pre-existing identities or identifying with that community to begin with. So in other words, if you think in terms of Atlanta or in terms of New York or one of the major cities, and Muslims are not, because to me it seems that physical proximity is integral to community formation and community consciousness. But so if you don't see the people that you are supposed to identify with in your neighborhoods or in the bus stop or in the schools. It is very much going to be an abstraction. Maybe some religious occasions may bring people together occasionally once or twice a year, but it is not like the daily experience of the other in community that can be expected in these conditions. The last point I want to mention at this level is the question of expectations of this homogeneity both among the immigrant communities and among the host communities. And that to what extent we need, in fact, to encourage the counter consciousness. I mean, not to create a sense that we are together and we are similar because we are Muslims, because we are many other things too. And being Muslim does not exhaust who we are, does not define who each of us is, and therefore that can be more conducive to a healthier integration process than sort of the sense of coming in as a block who's going to act as a block and interact as a block and so on.
Thank you. Jihu.
Okay. I suppose I'm supposed to focus on African Christian immigrants, which leaves me with a big problem. You know, Africa, 16% of the world's population, maybe a quarter of the world's Christians, and not only that, African immigrants to the U.S. are among the most recent. Some scholars are referring to them as the last immigrants. And to give you an idea what that means, almost 50% of African immigrants in this country came after 2000. So it's a very young immigrant group, so to say. On the question of settlement and integration, there are other elements that I think ought to be mentioned. One is the fact that the educational attainments among these immigrants are among the highest. Perhaps only Korean immigrants have a higher educational attainment. The majority of them come from West Central Africa. In fact, a third of them come from Western Africa, and the Nigerians more represented than any other group. Now, on the issue of how Africans settle and interact and deal with issues of incorporation, it's important to bear in mind that they are widely dispersed throughout the country. So you won't hear somebody refer to a Nigeria town or a Kenya town anywhere because of this wide dispersal. That said, Southern California, Texas, New York, Maryland happen to be the main areas of concentration. African immigrants perhaps reflect the new understanding that straight line assimilation, or the old orthodoxy of Anglo-conformity, probably doesn't or will not hold for these new immigrants. For a number of different reasons. They can change their skin color, and they come from such a wide diversity of groups, religions, cultures, and backgrounds, but also because of the issue of transnationalism, which is to say their capacity to retain very strong ties with the homeland is stronger than ever before. So many of these immigrants happen to be social actors, not only in the American context, but also in the home context that they come from. In fact, for some of them, the possibilities of activism and influence in their homeland increases after the move and settle in a place like the U.S. So these sort of things will determine trajectory. On the assimilation thing, one more thing ought to be mentioned. In my research, my conclusion is that African immigrants strongly reflect what is referred to as segmented assimilation. which is to say that they assimilate in certain areas of their lives and not others. So in terms of English, in terms of education, in terms of social networks and interactions, they make every effort to adapt and fill the roles that they're expected to fill. But in other areas of their lives, religion, certain cultural values, certain understandings of family life, and so on, they remain quite African in their assumptions and in their outlook.
Thank you. Don?
Hi. I'd like to actually frame this question a little bit more broadly, maybe, than we've been discussing. The question that's posed about religious assimilation and integration of immigrants is actually not just a problem of immigrants. This is really one of the central features that has defined Western modernity since the 1700s. In the mid-1700s, governments in Europe began discussing as a possibility the emancipation of the Jews, who were the only large non-Christian minority living in Europe. And the granting of citizenship to Jews in Europe was not complete until the middle of the 19th century, and had a lot of fits and starts and was controversial and difficult at the time. And speaking in very broad terms, the deal that was reached between the emerging nation states of Europe, Germany and France and so forth, and the Jewish minorities in each of those countries was premised on the idea not so much of separation between church and state, which really was an American innovation initially, but was premised on the idea of religion becoming limited to the private sphere. And this was very out front and in public. You know, Napoleon's deal with the Jews in his conquered territories was to the Jews as individuals everything, meaning full rights as citizens, but to the Jews as a people, nothing. And Moses Mendelssohn in the 1750s and 60s summed this up by his pithy phrase, which has defined 2 centuries of debate since then, be a Jew at home and a man in the street. And the idea was that as a condition for participating in the public sphere, people were meant to act as kind of neutral, universal citizens. And whatever difference they wanted to manifest in religious terms or ethnic terms was meant to be limited to the home. It was meant to be made something private, not something to be out and about. And this has influenced the way that the United States, I think, still conducts its business in many ways. We live in a society with a tremendous openness towards individuals of all different backgrounds, as long as they're able to sort of make that bifurcation and leave distinctiveness of certain kinds out of the public sphere. The Pew Report on Jewish life that was published just last year indicates that this is still an ongoing issue for the American Jewish community. And I would offer that those communities that have been most successful at limiting religion entirely to the private sphere are those same communities that have lost a sense of vibrant religious life and distinctiveness. And so one of the challenges that I think faces immigrant groups, minority groups as well in Europe and the United States today is how to renegotiate that basic bargain of modernity, which says that participation is dependent upon assimilation, at least a public assimilation, and how to balance that against the desire for vibrant, full social life of different kinds. That might include differences of dress and differences of speech and differences of food and differences of ethnic and national identity as well as differences of religion. Religion in America became the one permissible difference, which is why Jews define themselves as denominational groups like Protestant churches, even though that's not exactly how they tend to define themselves, but because religious difference is guaranteed in the Constitution. And cultural, national, ethnic difference is not. So these are issues that I think speak not just to immigrants, but they speak to the whole structure of the way our society is put together. And it seems to me that we can't really talk about even immigrants in a very clear way until we understand that this is part of the whole thing. This is how we're put together as a society. And I think that there's going to be more thinking about this as we become more global and more multicultural as time goes by. But this is something with very, very deep roots. It's not an issue of the last 20 years or 30 years.
Reverend Lyons with perhaps a different perspective?
I do have a different perspective, and my perspective, I guess, is from personal experience. First and foremost, from taking trips all over the world as a missionary, going to mission trips, and then being appointed as a pastor to a place like Clarkston, Georgia, which per mile radius, it has the most dense population of immigrants and refugees almost in the nation. When I came to Clarkston, Georgia, I had no idea that it was like a mini United Nation. It blew my mind that so many different and diverse people could be in a mile radius and still be able to be in community with each other. I'm the pastor of Clarkston United Methodist Church. We have 3 diverse congregations that partner with us and worship on Sundays. We have a Light Mission Pentecostal church with individuals who are from Congo, Sudan, and Rwanda. And then we have a Asian congregation that worships with us from 4 to 7. The first one worships at 12:30 to 4 o'clock, and we worship at 11 o'clock to 12:30. One of the things that I really like about all of us worshiping together, even though we're diverse in our backgrounds, diverse in where we were born, is that there is a unity that happens when we all come together. And you can see that unity because I think the bind that connects us is the fact that we can look at each other and we can show that we love each other, no matter where we're from, no matter what background we're from, and no matter what situation we're in. If you can look at each other and say that you're coming with the love of God, then they embrace that. One of the things that they tell me as a pastor that people have stopped doing and they wish people would do more of is that people don't come into the communities anymore. People don't come into people's houses anymore. And in order for people who are from Sudan or the Congo or even Eritrea, they will embrace you better as a church, as a Christian, as a religious person, if you show that you embrace their families and you embrace their communities. We have an Eritrean community that is part of our membership of our congregation, so they are members with us. And one of the things that we have noticed when you invite other people into your congregation as members, as guests, is that there is a unity. We all are under the body of Christ, but there's also the fact that we have to identify with their diversity. People worship in different ways, and to be able to allow people to be expressive in their worship experience is something that we need to be able to offer, because the congregation that I pastor was primarily a Caucasian congregation. They realized that they had to invite the community into the congregation or they would die. And they started inviting some left. A lot of people in the congregation left years ago. But the ones that are there now have embraced the community, and that's why we have so many diverse congregations who are worshiping in our church and worshiping in the church that's down the street from us, which changed their name to Clarkston International Bible Church, to allow people to come in of different nationalities, different cultures, and be able to worship. The number 2 thing we realized is the whole language barrier. There's a huge language barrier, and you know there's an expectation that they come over and they have to learn English. And for a lot of the older adults, it's hard for them to learn English, but all the kids and all the youth know English, so they have to interpret it for their families. So what we have started doing in our congregation is when we have worship service, we allow them to be able to sing and to also interpret the sermon in their own languages. And they do the same thing when we come and worship with them. They always have an interpreter available, so if there's anybody who does not understand the language which they are speaking, they will either have one of the people from the congregation come and sit next to you, or they will interpret it while the preacher is preaching the sermon. So it's amazing what is happening in Clarkston, because people know which areas and which communities that there are people from the same different parts of the country who have have come into Georgia to live. And so it's rich. It's rich with heritage. It's rich and diverse. And I'm just having an extremely good time learning about other people because they're open to sharing.
So my next question actually builds well on what we just talked about, I think. There are a couple scholars of migration, Castles and Miller, who have called the era that we are in now and the era that is sort of marked by particularly increases in transportation technology, but also increases in information technology as the age of migration. Migration has always been a global factor. People have always been on the move, but the scale of migration is far greater now than it has ever been before. And one of the things that Castles and Miller also point out is that before the mid-20th century, migration tended to be unidirectional. So it meant a lot of people going to the US at any given time or going to Europe at a given time. But migration is now much more multi-directional. We see a lot of more people moving back and forth between places, more cosmopolitanism, but also just more migration flows from places, say, within Africa to other places within Africa, places within Asia to other places within Asia. If we are sort of living in the age of migration, I'm wondering what impact that then has on forms of religiosity. And I think I might start with Dawn on this one because I feel like it's sort of where you left off in your last response. So we're going to have to face, with greater multiculturalism, with greater migration flows, we have to sort of face up to the issues that you're raising. One question is, if Protestant Christianity often influenced the way that Judaism was practiced as Jewish individuals moved into a U.S. context, as we now see greater flows of individuals from other parts of the world, does Protestant Christianity begin to change? Is there more impact and influence on the practice of religiosity in the U.S. and Europe from outside? And do we continue to see the sort of influence of more majoritarian or dominant cultures within places like the U.S.?
Well, sure. That's a big question to bite off. A lot of my research focused on Ethiopian immigrants in the state of Israel, which is a much smaller microcosm than the United States. But I would say the following, for sure. I mean, anybody who walks around Atlanta or any other city today can't help but be struck by the very kind of public celebration and influence of African Christianity, of Islam, of Latin American Christianity on the United States, and that's true in every city. And so things are changing in a way that's very powerful, and I think the level of base tolerance for religious difference in America is probably greater today than it has been at any time in the past. There are mosques growing every place, and there are people like me walking around on a university campus wearing religious garments who probably wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that 30 or 40 years ago. And you can attend Emory today without having to attend classes on the Sabbath or have to attend a church service. So religious difference and tolerance of no religion has also, I think, grown by leaps and bounds. But this is very mixed across the world, across the United States as well, but across the world. If you look at another region that I've spent some time studying, which is the Levant, the Mediterranean region, Mediterranean Europe and the Middle East. So one of the things you find is that there's a tremendous kind of mixing going on. So Pentecostalism is taking root in Catholic countries, historically Catholic countries, and developing significant minorities in places like Italy and Greece, Orthodox countries, and much smaller groups of Christian immigrants, Pentecostals and missionaries, are developing communities in the Muslim Middle East, in the southern Mediterranean, the eastern Mediterranean, and vice versa. In other words, Islam is a religion of the West now as much as any other religion. And by the way, Hinduism and Buddhism also are well represented in the United States because those sort of geographical boundaries of religious life are not the same anymore. However, this has posed a lot of problems, which is that the United States at least is framed in theory as a society in which, because there's a separation of church and state, there's no inherent difficulty, at least in theory, with being a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jew or whatever, and an American. But that's not true in much of the world. So the idea of being a Protestant Italian is still difficult. The idea of being a Christian Egyptian is extraordinarily difficult. And I'm very concerned about the persecution of Christians that's going on in many parts of the Middle East today. Some of them ancient communities, but also newer communities that are getting started. And I think that part of our problem is that we haven't yet really identified this as a core concern of American diplomacy, which is that we have to demand from our various partners around the world the willingness to live with religious diversity, because there's no way of really constructing the world anymore without religious diversity. But the flows of people and ideas are not equal in every direction. And some countries are more recipients of people and ideas. Some are more, I don't know what the word would be, but purveyors of people and ideas moving in the other direction. And this has caused tremendous turmoil and tremendous uncertainty in a lot of places. And sometimes uncertainty leads to repression. So I think that this is something that we need to be very aware of and talk about, certainly in this country, but I think that the manifestations in this country are relatively mild. I mean, it's not pleasant when you live through it, but relatively mild given what's going on in many other parts of the world.
One of the other aspects of that is the exchange of ideas, the exchange of religious ideas, and theological development. So, Jihu, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that a sort of global Christian theology is evolving and changing as you have more folks coming to Europe or to the United States from places like Africa, from places like Asia. I know when I was a theology student at Candler, in systematics, I was reading Korean theologians, I was reading diasporic African theologians, as well as theologians operating in Africa now, which is probably not true of the folks who went through that program 20 or 30 years before me. So could you speak a little bit about how in the age of migration, we see changes in developments in theology?
Sure, but first of all, let me comment on the age of migration phrase. It's valid on many different levels. Yes, we're living at a time when the volume and velocity of migration is unprecedented. But in some other ways, we have to recognize that the current experience of migration has restrictions that earlier ages didn't have. So for instance, 100 years ago, migrant movement was a lot more unrestricted than it is today, which is why we talk so much about undocumented or unauthorized immigrants in contemporary parlance. And the assumption that earlier the migration was largely one direction, I think it's a little bit Eurocentric. There were millions of Chinese moving, Africans and other categories moving as well. Even certainly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But it is true that migration today, specifically international migration today, is more multidirectional than ever before. But even then, there are certain dominant strands. So for instance, south to north flows tend to be pretty dominant, which is to say, for instance, that in many developed countries, North America, Europe, some 70 to 80% of the immigrants come from the developing countries. So there are certain dominant strands. And the one last one I would mention is that according to a Pew study, about 50% of international migrants are Christian. So there is this massive upsurge of Christian movement within these migratory flows that is worth noting, and you were hinting at that. Now to the question of theological formulation, I would say there's really no such thing as a global theology. Theology is always contextual. It emerges out of specific experiences, specific reflections of God, the human condition, and so on and so forth. But it is true that this era of migration is bringing together increasing numbers of diverse peoples into conversation. And so that opens up spaces for thinking through particular assumptions, particular understandings of the world. Among other things, the old orthodoxies of a Western normative theological tradition that everybody should learn no longer hold. And so these kinds of interactions facilitate a better understanding of the nature of the church, of its encounters, of its potential, of its possibilities, of its failures, and so on and so forth. So I would say that's where you have the greatest dynamism and potential for theological reflection.
Thank you. And sort of similarly but different, I wonder, Reverend Lyons, if you could talk a little bit about the adoption of new religious practices. So it's not, obviously, religiosity is not all in our head and beliefs. There is also liturgical practices, ritual practices. And I imagine bringing a diverse community together, you've experienced a diverse set of ritual and liturgical practices. So if you could speak a bit about that, how your community received it, and how it sort of changed your worship.
I think one of the key questions that a lot of them expressed after I asked, what is the key difference between the churches in the United States and the churches from where you are from? And they said one of the key differences in terms of the worship experience is that a lot of the experiences over here they feel are traditional, or they're kind of quiet, or there's really any noise, and they said normally from a lot of places that they come from, they're able to freely express, and it's considered over here being charismatic, even though they freely express what they are feeling, what they are believing, and what they are loving about God. They freely express it. They love to use instruments. They love to use the congos. The congos speak, the drums speak. So there's something deep within them, they say, that they get from being able to use and to utilize the drums and the other instruments. They love singing, but they also love moving. So the praise and the worship, they love, it's an integral part of the worship experience to them. And sometimes we a lot of times cut that part of the service short. They want to be able to have services in 2 or 3 different languages, as opposed to the services always being just in English, so that they can utilize their language, their native language, and that we can also learn something from them. So those are the major things that have been brought to our attention.
Thank you. Abdu, I'm interested particularly your work on American Muslims, your most recent book, about your thoughts on, as you said, Islam is, while there have been Muslim communities in the United States for a long time, smaller communities, the widespread practice of Islam in the U.S. is a relatively newer phenomenon. And so I'm wondering if, in your observation of that practice, if you've seen an American Islam developing. We have American Muslims. You've identified yourself as an American Muslim. Are we seeing an American Islam developing? So is the sort of practice changed by the new context of people who are bringing Islam with them to the United States?
I'm sure that the practice of Islam is changing among Muslims, but I wouldn't know how to call it American, because I don't think there is an American anything. It is a multitude of experiences that people have, and to each, their experience is American experience. What I was thinking actually through some of the remarks earlier on is the role of this group here. With all due respect, I mean, I'm referring to you as maybe mediators of cross or interreligious communication and understanding. That it is you who very much shape how issues are framed, how experiences are described or analyzed and understood. And there is a phenomenon that I call Christianization of Islam, that maybe it is a personal experience, but where I come from, the type, I think religious experience is always local. And I think I emphasize with that very much. It's immediate and local and personal. But when we come into large communities and massive cities, often our experiences are translated into something that readership or audiences can understand. And I think in that translation, there is some, I wouldn't call it distortion, but adaptation to something that people tend to from that point on, expect to see and to find. And I wonder if that goes back to the practicing community in a way that also we know that we are supposed to do this just like others expect us to do it. Recently I had experience with Ramadan. Of course, Ramadan has become a familiar theme and an institution among Americans. And most people, I find, American who are not Muslims, would empathize with Ramadan, will try to understand it, and there is no hostility, there is no anxiety about it. On the contrary, it is seen as a deeply spiritual time that all people experience. But the accommodation of Muslims' practice of cultures of Ramadan and cultures of the seasons of the year, when Ramadan ends and begins, is beginning to impact Muslims' understanding of the phenomena. I don't know if my point is coming across clearly enough. Let me give a quick example. The Muslim calendar is the lunar calendar. And therefore, the beginning and end of Ramadan and the religious holidays that are associated with it and with the pilgrimage are lunar, not with the common calendar. But how can you expect accommodation when you can't tell your colleagues or your boss when you need your holiday? You can't say that I need my religious holiday either on Tuesday or Thursday or Friday, depending on the new moon. And I expect that people are beginning to calculate more than observe the new moon, so that we can have a regularization of the religious experience. And whether that is a good or a bad thing, I'm not sure, but it is something that will have sort of ripple effect throughout the community in other ways too.
Thank you. Religion is constantly changing, right? That's one thing that we know. It's always in development. It's always adapting, or new ideas are coming forward, new practices are coming forward, and that is always related to the context, as both Abdu and Jihu have pointed out. As a context changes, a religion changes. And sometimes religions change to react or reject changes in context, but there are still changes within tradition. So if religion is always changing, and if immigration is a sort of constant theme, then not to totally undermine this panel that I've put together, but are we focusing too much on immigrant religion? Is there an immigrant religion, or is what's happening in terms of immigrants bringing new ideas, new practices, the export of ideas from transnational networks, just part of the regular development of religious ideas and practices that has occurred over the millennia that each of these traditions has existed? Does anybody want to pick that one up first?
I want to defend the notion.
Okay.
When migrants move, they move with their beliefs, they move with their ideas, their religious practices, and so in that sense, you can see there's an immigrant religion in that limited sense. Mm-hmm. But it's not a religion simply specific to the immigrant. It's a religion, or it's a set of practices and values reflective of the wider group that they left. Okay, so in that sense. And that allows me also to make the point that in the American context, and I want to come back, get to this issue, the Claxton experience is uncommon, which is to say that to find situations where immigrant Christians, and I'll use it, immigrant Christians and homegrown Christians interact on a regular basis in terms of free accommodation and acceptance is uncommon, okay? And that, in fact, for the most part, what you find between immigrant Christian communities or constituencies and homegrown churches is disengagement, even some degree of, you might say, alienation. So that's very important. So taken as a whole in the American experience, you don't find, and maybe that corrects the point I was making earlier about theological interactions, that yes, you can have the kind of mutual stimulation you may have at Candler or certain settings, but you also have the mutual disqualification and rejection that goes on because of the unfamiliar or because one uses one's own ideas as a norm for practice. So I think that's important, that we understand that in the American religious landscape, the currents and flows represented by immigration do not meet or encounter a context where there is full acceptance or open embrace.
I wonder, Abdu or Don, Jihu points out an interesting dynamic in the American Christian context. Do you see similar or different things in the Jewish and Islamic context in terms of immigrant communities meeting in the same space, worshiping with established communities, or tensions between new and established religious communities?
Okay. Actually, I was thinking that, in fact, we have an intra-Islamic phenomenon of the same nature, meaning that for the first time, probably for many of the immigrant Muslims, that they have come in contact with other immigrant Muslims from other parts of the world whose experience and practice of Islam is quite significantly different. And that creates an anxiety that, in fact, keeps sort of there is a level of tension and alienation within so to assume that all Muslims can get along fine is misleading, that they can practice well together is misleading. In fact, talking about Clarkston and the Somali community, for example, specifically in Clarkston, which is the area that we heard is such a dense population, people who share the language, the history, the culture, and the religion, all Muslims, worship in totally isolated mosques. And you will find some of them will never enter the next mosque, no matter what. So they would rather not pray at all than to pray in the Sunni mosque or in the Sufi mosque and so on. So it is, I think, that Indian continent Muslims coming in contact with African Muslims for the first time, you wouldn't find the solidarity and the affinity that you would expect otherwise. So I think there are many assumptions that we tend to assume because they are Muslims, they are sort of close to each other, or not necessarily. And maybe because they are Muslims, they are not close to each other.
I live in a neighborhood here in Atlanta that has a Persian synagogue, a Bukharian synagogue, two synagogues of people from mostly Euro-American ancestry. And at different times there have been others. There's been a Moroccan congregation. There are Russian congregations. There are Israeli congregations. So for sure, this is important. And it's not a new story. You know, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, some came to America across the ocean blue, but most settled across North Africa and the Levant and Holland and places like that. And almost everywhere they went, they established their own separate synagogues alongside the synagogues of the local Berber or Arabic-speaking or whatever Jewish community. was already there. So that's not new. But there are a couple of things that I think are new. First of all, just in terms of the Jewish community, is that over the last 100 years, everybody has become an immigrant. So we don't often think about it, but there's not a single large Jewish community that is still really in the same place now that it was 100 years ago. And if you think about, the United States, a place like New York was just growing 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more. But every large community has either been destroyed or dislocated. People have moved. There's a lot of mobility. I just learned now that 50% of migrants are Christians. I didn't know that. International migrants. I didn't know that. That's a fascinating statistic. And when you look at the Jewish community, it's not, we represent a very small number of migrants, but vis-a-vis our own population, everybody is a migrant. And that changes something. So there's a lot more mixing today than there ever was. Even though there are these different synagogues, but the social barriers are lower than I think they ever were. Partly that's because Israel has served as a kind of melting pot for different Jewish communities. The community that I've spent a long time doing research with, the Ethiopian community, is among the newer immigrants. They only started leaving Ethiopia really in the 1980s and 90s, and they still tend to have their own separate synagogues and their own separate institutions. But my impression is that will change to some degree over time. But I'd like to add one other thing, which is that I think that migration and the way that the world is migrating today affects religion in general in particular ways, which is that the simple fact of the enormous flow of people across borders today and the way that global capital changes and moves and shifts around encourages certain forms of religion more than others. In other words, it's not an accident, I think, that charismatic Christianity of different kinds, not only Pentecostalism, but charismatic Christianity is so vibrant and so huge today. And I think that charismatic Christianity has its analogs in Judaism and probably in Islam and in other places. And part of that is because the idea of personal experience and me as an individual being able to kind of set the contours of my religious life and take it with me portably and not be tied to a particular community or the cemetery where my grandparents are buried or other kinds of institutions that require a lot of stability. It's not surprising to me that seems to be a trend around the world in different religious communities. And then finally, a third thing, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, but another role played by migrants very often is the role of migrant or diaspora religion and nationalism being in contact with sort of the homeland in ways that are sometimes polarizing. And so, diaspora Hinduism is very involved in Hindu nationalism in India, and we could talk about Jewish diasporas and Muslim diasporas and also all kinds of other things. So in many cases, it's not just that there are people moving, but there are people moving who now have a stronger position to influence the communities from which they came. And that's a huge can of worms that we're just beginning to understand.
One of the, building on that, and on this question of sort of immigrant religion, one of the things that scholars of Latino and Latina religion and immigration note a lot is the way in which the migrant journey itself becomes a principal religious focal point. So it becomes a sort of a defining experience, which is not unexpected when you think about the process of migrating. But there's a theology, there's a religiosity that builds up around the experience of migrating itself. So, for example, the practice of venerating Saint Toribio Romo, who's the sort of patron saint of undocumented migrants, has grown significantly over the years. And for those who cross the southern border, Father Romo becomes a sort of central figure in their spirituality, their religiosity. We don't have any Latino or Latina scholars on the panel, which is why I think it's actually interesting to pose this question, because they've written a lot about this. But I wonder about your perspectives on the way in which the process of migration becomes a factor in the religiosity of individuals who have undergone it? And I'll start down at the end with Reverend Lyons.
Very good question. I would have to say a lot of it, I think, starts with the church. I mean, the church has had a huge impact on sending people over to other countries, various countries, and doing effective things, empowering people, not just giving people handouts, but empowering people, giving resources, computers, ways for us to communicate and be in contact with each other on a daily or a monthly basis. So us going over to countries and them coming into our country, into the United States is something that we all want and we desire. One of the things that I see happening and that they're saying also is they see more diverse people coming over than they saw before. Generally, they would always see, I would say, a Caucasian face. And now they're seeing a multi diverse faces coming over, and they really like that. And also, if I could just add a point, because it's just been on my mind as we've been talking, is someone quoted, and you can see it a lot still today, is Sunday is the most segregated day of the week that we see in a lot of our churches, synagogues, mosque, whatever, is the most segregated day of the week. But that is changing. That is truly changing with the migration, because people are coming over and they're feeling that their family, that their community, and they're breaking down those barriers of feeling like they're somebody else. It's I, them. It's not I, them anymore. It's we, us. And this is just a small microcosm of what's going to happen with the entire world. So we have to get ready for it and get used to the migration on both sides.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that question?
I just would like to add, I'm not sure if to the question, but the centrality of migration in Islam is that the Prophet is the ultimate migrant. And in fact, the Islamic calendar is marked by the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina. So that is almost day one of the Muslim calendar, in a way, is the day of the migration of the Prophet. And that Muslims also have migrated, escaping persecution in Mecca, and went to Ethiopia, where a Christian king was celebrating their coming and welcoming them. And that also resonated back in the culture and sort of the popular culture of Muslim societies, to say that migration is an honor. It is not a shame. It's something that you follow the Prophet's example in doing it. The other point also is vulnerability during migration. I think that the sense of security and normality that we get from settling somewhere is really not particularly helpful to religious awakening and internal transformation that religion is supposed to instill. So in a way, I think reflecting about it, that migration is something that should be encouraged, so because it opens up our sense of comfort and taking things for granted, and exposes our vulnerability and our need to share and to seek shelter with the stranger. So there are many, I think, religious values that could be maybe shared between these communities that come out of immigration or associated with it.
Okay, this question is a very important one. In fact, I'm wrestling with it at the moment, and it's not as clear as I would like it to be. The American historian Timothy Smith said migration is a theologizing experience. And he was drawing on the issue of earlier European immigrants and comparing it to the Old Testament record. And more recent research has confirmed that religiosity tends to intensify when people move. Okay, so the trauma of displacement, the vulnerability, the experience of being an outsider, strengthens religious consciousness. But also, of course, in the American experience, where religious community is such a central element in migrant existence and how migrants navigate their encounters with the wider society. But a recent research from Princeton seems to suggest that, and I think a lot of has to do with the assumptions that the researchers are making, seems to suggest that for many immigrants recent immigrants to the United States, religiosity, certainly what they think as religiosity in terms of, say, church attendance, mosque attendance, that doesn't help, of course, with Hindus who don't attend the place. But the claim is that it declines, it's lower than it was before the migrants left, countries of origin. The caveat there, of course, is this is not true for all migrants. It's true for certain migrants. For some migrants, it's the opposite. Korean migrants are even more religious. After the move, the same goes for migrants from Guatemala and El Salvador. So it has to be nuanced. But I would say, on balance, it is true that the migrant experience or being immigrants tends to strengthen religious consciousness and affinities. That, I think, is where we are at the moment. And like Islam, Christianity has a very strong central migrant motif in its imagination, in how it spreads, and how it understands the faith. So,
yeah, can I add something to that? So, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said here. I think that it's a little misleading to talk about migration or immigration as if it's a single phenomenon. As it makes a very big difference whether you're a refugee running for your life, or a labor migrant sending money back home, or a highly skilled worker who's moving for a better job. There are many different ways of thinking about travel, or a pilgrim going to the Holy Land, or something like that. And movement is a human universal, but the meanings of movement are always very local and specific in a kind of a way. Now, talk about mobility. We say the word mobility, and we tend to think of that as a positive development. And in many cases it is. I mean, it's better to be mobile than not to be mobile, because, you don't have a passport and the tanks come rolling through. You're kind of stuck in a bad way. And communities that have had that experience tend to like being mobile. They hold on to passports whenever they can. They get multiple passports. I know a lot of people like that. But these things also, there's a kind of emotive a component of travel, of migration, that shifts also in historical terms. So the historian Jonathan Sarna stated, actually at a visit to Emory several years ago, he said, the Jews in modern times have gone from being what we used to call a world religion to being a first world religion. It's kind of funny, that Jews get able to be talked about in this context, because there are 12 million Jews in the world, something like that. I don't know how many Muslims or Christians there are, but Jews are a very tiny minority. But we get a lot of bang for the buck. Maybe we have a lot of academics or journalists, I don't know. But it used to be that there were small Jewish communities every place you went in the world. And for a variety of reasons over the last 2 or 3 generations, that has become less and less the case. So Jewish communities throughout Europe, throughout the Middle East, have diminished or vanished, and they've been reconstituted in a very few countries, in North America and Australia, and a few cities in Europe and in Israel. And while Jewish mobility or migration in pre-modern times was often characterized as exile, it wasn't diaspora, it was characterized as exile. It had theological meaning of being spread apart and cast about around the world. And it was meaningful not just to Jews, but to Christians, who also had certain theological motifs associated with Jews being spread around the world. And, for a variety of reasons, both secularization and Zionism, as sort of the two sides of the coin, travel for Jews in the last 2 generations has come to mean something different. So on the one hand, you have secularization, which means sort of, you're not exiled from anything. And at the same time, those people who do feel exiled don't have to be right there, because there's this homecoming that is represented for them by the rise of the State of Israel. So you have to get a handle on the affective meanings of movement before you can really describe what it is. And I'll just plug something very quickly. I'm the editor of a book series in the anthropology of religion, and We have a book coming out hopefully later this year on refugee experience and religion, which is not something that's gotten a lot of play in academia before. But if you think about it, it's obvious that religion is so important to the experience of being refugees. It's a theologizing experience. I agree with that. And I think that we need to start talking in more experiential terms about certainty and vulnerability and different gradations of that, rather than just about movement from one place to the next, as if that was somehow a neutral category. It's not neutral for the people who live it.
Thank you all, and let's open it up to you out in the audience. Just as a reminder, if you'll identify yourself and pose a question. We welcome any and all.
Hi, my name's Adele Banks. I work for Religion News Service. I wanted to ask Reverend Lyons what it's like at your church at 12:30 and 4 when there's the switchover, and whether these three congregations ever interact with one another.
Good question. When I leave my 11 o'clock service, traditional United Methodist Church service at 12:15, and start hearing the drums at 12:20, knowing that we should be finished by 12:15, I am so excited to enter the 12:30 service because they have lots and lots of kids and lots of youth and lots of young adults. And the kids start off by praising and singing, and then after the kids, the youth get up and start praising and singing. And after the youth, the adults get up and start praising and singing. That goes on until about 5 minutes to 1 o'clock. And then the sermon begins, and it's a opening experience for me because I'm allowed to worship with different and diverse people in different ways, and so it just opens my whole horizons and my mind to be, when I think that I'm open and realize that a lot of things about what I think and what I do and what I say are closed-minded. Visiting other services opens my mind and my perspective. And then going to the 4 o'clock, the first time, and then it's a long day because our service starts at 9:45. So when I finish at 4 o'clock, and I don't always stay until 4 o'clock. Sometimes I leave at 1 o'clock because I just have to get the praise, the praise part. I've already had a sermon. I've listened to one sermon. And then 4 o'clock is so different because that's the Zoe Manuel Church, and they're from Asia. And so their worship experience is a little different, and it's a little low-keyer in terms of the worship expressive experience, but the music is beautiful. I mean, it does something inside of you to move you. And so the key thing about both of those services is that they do community so well. I mean, you walk in and you realize that they do whatever they possibly can to make you feel at home. They have an interpreter. They acknowledge your presence. If you want to pray or say something, they allow you to say something. And so it has helped me to go back to my congregation and be more open to different kinds of people and to acknowledge them when they're there. So I hope I answered your question. What? Yes, we do. Once a month, two of us meet for communion together. And then Zoe Manuel, what we're planning on, I just got there, but what we're planning on doing is we're planning on every year, Thanksgiving and Christmas, to have a worship service together, the Sunday preceding Thanksgiving, the Sunday preceding Christmas. And they're open to that.
Awesome. My name is Zachary Enos. I'm with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. This question is primarily for Dr. Seaman. And I want to say, by way of preface, thank you so much. I thought you offered an incredibly lucid expression of the idea that public and private tensions between expressions of personal, both communal and private faith commitments are kind of one of the most precious, most cherished legacies of a free society. So thank you for that. The question has two prongs. The first is, in your opinion, could you kind of reflect for a moment on what you think are the most important flashpoints between public and private spiritual identity, the expression of that. And if you would, please reflect first on domestic conflicts and then international conflicts. And the reason I bring up domestic, even though I think from your perspective they're much more mild, is because I'm sensing from your comments that you see the United States as something of a politically viable model for the exportation of a religiously diverse model for other societies. And then the second prong of the question is, which communities, both internationally and domestically, do you think are doing the best job of addressing those flashpoints, and why, so that we can replicate their success?
Well, that's quite a question. I'm not sure I'll get to all of that, but I'm happy, if anything gets left out, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I think the United States is a wonderful experiment. And it works in certain ways, and it has great power. It's not the model that is appropriate for every country and every part of the world. I think many countries around the world have a sense of an establishment religion, whether it be in a relatively weak sense, like the Church of England, or a stronger sense, like in Israel or in many Muslim countries. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that, but they pose different kinds of problems, and those problems need to be sort of thought through. Let me just maybe frame this a little bit. It seems to me that the separation model that we have in the United States is partly brought about by the fact that our model of government is based on a model of limited government. In other words, the fundamental tension that is expressed in our system is that people don't want the government having too much power over their individual lives, and there's a fear of sort of the government as tyrant always behind the scenes in the American imagination. But I think that in many parliamentary countries that's not the case, and that the basic tension that is behind the scenes is civil war. And so the main concern is not so much limiting the government, but limiting the control of this or that group within society over the other groups, right? So there's a kind of negotiation of that to prevent civil strife. And I think that Americans need to be careful not to assume that every place can or should operate just the way that America does. For example, I think the American model lends itself to a kind of juridically driven abstract process. We have a principle called separation of church and state. And then we can argue about whether that includes, the Ten Commandments being on a courthouse. Does it include somebody putting up a cross or a Hanukkah menorah in a public park? Or, those kinds of things. And we can argue about these sort of abstract principles. And we have a sense that we want it to all be coherent and make sense, right? We want there to be a principle that you can apply in every case. And the courts work that out and so forth. But I think that in many other settings, it's sometimes much better to have negotiated solutions rather than abstract principles. Because if you craft an abstract principle that leads any group to really feel disenfranchised at the end of the day, then that leads to civil strife. And so the coherency of the system matters to me less. I'll give you an example of a very, talk about a flashpoint. Here's a flashpoint for you. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, right, or the Al-Aqsa compound, the Temple Mount for Jews. This is a site of tremendous tension because it's claimed as a very holy site by two different religions, which are also represented by different national groups, national movements. And almost anything you do there can lead to, conflagration, and has in the past. So on the one hand, I think, the American model says or encourages you to think, well, you just need a set of principles to negotiate this. Like, take a principle like freedom of worship. So, okay, I believe in freedom of worship, so maybe anybody should be allowed to worship on that site in the way that they want to worship. And I can appreciate that. I mean, there's a mosque there, but there's probably room also for a synagogue or a church or whatever else somebody wants. And, in Israel, although the chief rabbinate doesn't currently allow Jews to worship there for internal Jewish reasons, but it's also because we don't want a war on the Temple Mount. And on the other hand, there are small groups, civil groups of Jews who are constantly going to the Supreme Court and asking for the right to pray on the Temple Mount because it's a holy site and they want to pray there and they don't care what the chief rabbinate has to say about it. Now, on the grounds of simple sort of freedom of religious expression, they're right. There's no particular reason that the government should prevent them from, right now, forget about a synagogue. If you walk up there and your lips move like you're praying, they will arrest you because they don't want trouble, right, on the Temple Mount. So from a kind of abstract point of view, the people who are claiming freedom of expression are right. They should be able to go there and pray if that's what they want to do. And in the context of a final peace agreement, I'm hopeful that they will have that right. But in real world terms, it would be a disaster to have a war start there every 3 weeks because somebody got angry and there was a rock thrown or a Molotov cocktail and all of a sudden people are being killed. So, the way they've worked it out in practical terms in Israel is that the Supreme Court says everybody has the right to worship there, but that right can be revoked by the police if they think that it's going to lead to trouble. And the police just routinely, they don't give the right because they say, we know there's going to be trouble. So that's an attempt. It's not perfect. There are a lot of problems, but it's an attempt to reach, I put it this way, rather than have the principal rule, it's an attempt to have everybody have just enough that they don't feel that they have to go to war. And from a realistic point of view, I think that's a very important principle also, which is that sometimes you give up on coherency and you just allow everybody in the map to get enough that they have just the basic satisfaction, not everything they want, maybe not everything they're entitled to, but just enough that we can keep a lid on a simmering problem until there's a better solution. So I don't want to try to impose the American model everywhere. I think that would be a disaster. But I think that the American model is useful to think about everywhere. And I think we can insist on certain things. I mean, I think the idea that you can be killed for your religious practice is something we shouldn't stand for anywhere. But that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that an American separation model ought to be imposed every place. I think it works here because we have a very particular history. So I don't want to monopolize, but I'll be happy to talk to you more about that afterwards.
Hi, my name is Jack Gordon, and I'm a board member with the Interfaith Conference of Metropolitan Washington. And I'm just reflecting on the panel and the traditions that are represented there. It's religions that have very long histories and are steeped in sometimes very specific, rich cultural heritages, depending on the geography of the community where it's existing. And just reflecting on my own religious community, which is the Baha'i community, and hearing some of the tension points, or just sort of the facts of life that there's a Russian community over here, or Moroccan, or whatever the case is, or that they're happening in different languages separately and so forth, and that's something that's not present in the Baha'i community. That in the Baha'i community, which is made up of, in the United States, very largely of immigrants from any number of countries, and there's always this multi-directional migration that's happening within the community, that it would be unheard of to have any sort of separation, that there are always different styles of worship and languages that are happening there simultaneously in community events. And I think that part of it has to do with the philosophy and principle at the core of the religion, but I also think that it's sort of intermingled with the fact that the faith community itself, its origins are entirely within this modern period where we have globalization happening as a norm. And so that this community that emerges in the late 1800s is happening at the same time that we're becoming a more rapidly interconnected community. So I'm just curious how you might see more recent religious movements or traditions. I'm thinking primarily of the case of the Baha'is just because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but there may be similarities and differences with perhaps the Latter-day Saint community or Unitarians or what have you, movements and communities that have emerged in much more modern times and ways in which these migration issues and interconnectivity issues have been more or less successful.
Anybody want to take a shot at it?
Well, I'll make a comment. I think the point was made earlier that globalization impacts religious life on the planet in many different kinds of ways. Among other things, it appears that we live on a very religious planet. I think the latest study was about 80% claim allegiance to one religion or the other. And I think for the younger religious movements, like you hinted at, they're emerging in an age of tremendous dynamism, which also means that how they forge their identities is going to be impacted by these new interconnectedness and flows. What I mean by that is, let me give you an example. Say, the Anglican Communion. Anglican is a word meaning English and so on. But now, 50% of Anglicans are African, okay? And that's just the African constituency. So what does that mean for Anglican identity, moving forward? And so, but for the newer movements, I think the negotiations and the flocks will be shaping identity even as the movement grows and spreads and takes root in different parts of the world. But maybe even for newer movements, the identities may still be contested. What does it mean to be a Baha'i in the US as opposed to Europe, for instance? And is there a Baha'i center of gravity? Where is that? And will that change over time as these currents continue to shape how we live and where we settle?
I don't have an answer to your question, really, but I'm jealous of newer religious movements because I don't know this for a fact, but it seems like it ought to be easier to reconcile a 20th century religious movement with modernity than it is, an Iron Age religious movement that has rules that, grew up in a very different setting. So I'm envious, but I don't have a real answer to your question.
And I think it opens up the communication when you have diverse religions, diverse beliefs, because I know in our community and various communities there's an interfaith coalition, and so we want to know more about each other's religious beliefs, and so the conversation is open more as opposed to it being so closed before. If you weren't my religion or if you didn't believe what I believe, a lot of people would just shut down and not even be in the conversation, whereas now people are more open to express what they believe. They want to know, so.
I would also suggest, and I don't know enough about the history of the Baha'i tradition to ground this in that particular experience, but suggest that the longer a religion exists, the longer it also has an opportunity for schism, and the more entrenched those schisms can become. So one of the things, if the Somali Sufi won't visit the Somali Sunni mosque, that has less to do with national or ethnic identity than it has to do with a very long-standing schism within a religious tradition. One of the ways in which we might also be jealous of new religious movements is that they haven't had as much of an opportunity to disagree internally, though there's always more opportunity in the future.
The joy of sects.
The problem, though, is that schisms very quickly take on national, ethnic, tribal distinctions, so that over time you think that it's religious, but then there are other roots that shape the division within the movement.
Absolutely.
And this raises a very difficult question, which is defining what religion is. I mean, how do you separate that out? So I understand why, when the president makes a speech for pragmatic political reasons, he has to say this is religion, this is not, this is not about Islam or it is. But that's a pragmatic question. He doesn't want to offend people. But as a religion scholar, I think it becomes much more difficult to unravel these things and figure out, where does religion end and nationalism begin? Are they even separable? And they may not always be separable. So it's very complicated.
Any final questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm Reverend Charlotte Fairchild. I write books. This year was 150 years since the Civil War came through the Battle of Atlanta. And I lived in Jacksonville, and I came very close to becoming a United Methodist minister in 1990. And this man was a minister, and he said, you know, we've got a South church here and a North church there. And that's when I found out that during the Civil War, the United Methodist Church or the United Episcopal Church split, and so you would have churches from both sides in the same city. And then someone else told me, well, you know, these balconies in these churches, that's where the black people would worship. So I was worshiping last Sunday in Atlanta First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And so I thought, wow, you know, I was sitting here, and of course, I guess the first immigrant was Abram, who became Abraham. But God told him to move. And I just thought of that when, I forgot your name, but the man in the middle, was talking about about the immigration having to do with becoming closer to God or seeking God or being more vulnerable and seeking God. And I just thought about that because here we are, 150 years since the Civil War. We've got churches and things that we don't even realize. I don't know other churches, whether they became split like the United Methodist. There probably were. And but I do know that there are a lot of differences, whether they're Methodist or Baptist or any Presbyterian or any of the other churches, just because of things like the Civil War, affecting them, and we don't even realize it because it's been 150 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
That wasn't a good question.
Would anyone like to make closing remarks? Well, in that case, why don't we take half an hour and we'll reconvene at 4 o'clock for the final panel of the day on human trafficking and religion. Thank you all very much, and thank you to our panelists.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.